So although this is a 6 tile mould, I'm going to show you how to make a 9 tile mould, because in hindsight I should have really made a 9 mould instead of a 6, because obviously the more compartments you've got, the more brick tiles you can make at any one time. So the first thing you're going to need to source is a piece of plastic or perspex. So I had a large piece of perspex lying in the garden, which was used in the past as a temporary repair for a piece of greenhouse glass that was smashed. Don't panic though if you can't find anything like perspex or plastic big enough to make the actual mould itself, because while you're in IKEA buying the flexible chopping boards, IKEA also do these type of trays, plastic trays. These are about £1.50, I think about $1.80 equivalent, and you can use the backside of one of these to do exactly the same thing. So what we also need is we need some old bricks. It depends what look you're going for, but with the pizza oven that I've done, I wanted like an old style brick appearance. So I found some old bricks, and all I've done is I've used a disc cutter to actually cut the ends off the bricks. So about a 5 or 6 mil piece. Just be careful obviously when you're doing that. So I've just sliced the end off the brick on both ends, and I've gone for bricks which have got quite a bit of character to them as well. So for a 9 compartment mould, you'll need 5 of these bricks, obviously, to get your 9 pieces. So once you've got those, just clean them up, give them a wipe on the back, make sure there's no dust on them. So once we've made sure that everything's nice and clean, the next thing we need to do is we need to take some blue tack. So we take a piece of blue tack, and what we want to do is to actually roll this out into almost like a very thin, long piece of string. If you're going to roll it on a worktop, make sure that the worktop is nice and clean, because otherwise the blue tack will pick up the dust off the worktop and it'll become less tacky. So once you've done that and you've got the blue tack nice and thin, the next thing we want to do is to go around the very outside edge underneath the piece of brick that you've actually cut. Just go around the outside edge with the blue tack, just pressing it down. If the blue tack is too thick, that means that this profile, because this will sit onto the plastic, that profile will be too thick, so your brick slips will end up quite heavy. So make sure this is as thin as you can get it. So what you'll end up with is just a very thin, almost like a rope of blue tack around the outside edge underneath. Okay, so the blue tack does 2 things. One is it will fasten the piece of brick in place so that when we pour the silicone into the mould, it's not going to move about. But more importantly, it prevents any silicone from seeping underneath here, which we don't want to do. So once we've got that in place, the next thing we want to do is position the piece of brick on our piece of plastic. And if you're using something like this, a tray, just bear in mind that you're going to be putting a wooden border around the outside edge, and we want ideally at least a centimetre gap between the brick and the piece of wood itself. So if you take the wood that you're going to use and just use that as a guide, and then everything, so from the top, the next piece of brick, and also obviously the outside edge there, we want to ideally have a centimetre in between, because that will make a very strong silicone mould. So once we're happy with the position, all we need to do then is just firmly press down around the outside edge, just to make sure that this slip, the blue tack actually sticks to the plastic. and when we're happy with that, we'll move on to the next one. If you press down and you get any blue tack coming around the outside edge, get a Stanley knife and just trim that off. That wants to be as neat as possible, because silicone will replicate any mark at all that it comes into contact with. So all of these, you might not be able to see it on the camera, but there's a lot of indentations and stuff. Silicone will go into there and that will be reproduced in the mould, but it will also reproduce any of the blue tack which has managed to find its way around outside of the edge. So once you have all of the brick slips positioned and all pressed down onto the blue tack and all fastened into place, of course I'm just using this as an example because I've already done the mould, I'm not going to do another one. You then need to put a wooden border around the outside edge, again just using these pieces as examples, that you get a centimetre gap all the way around the outside. So you measure the 4 pieces and then from the underneath just some pilot holes and just screw in from the underneath. So I'm just going to use this existing mould as an example. So what you'll end up with is you'll actually end up with 9 brick pieces, whereas obviously I've got 6 here, and they will all be pressed down into place with the blue tack running underneath. The next thing you need to do once you've put your wooden frame in is to take some more blue tack, roll it out in exactly the same way so it's nice and thin, and then run it around the inside edge all the way around the bottom where the plastic or perspex meets the wood on the inside, and also up the sides as well. Make sure that is all sealed in, because if it's not and you've got any spaces at all where silicone can leak out, it could potentially leak almost all of the silicone out, and it would be a completely wasted exercise and an expensive exercise. So make sure you take some time to do that. Press it all in. There's no leaks whatsoever once the silicone goes in. So the first video in this series explains exactly which silicone you're going to need and how much. I'm not going to go through that again, but what you need to do is, before you're going to mix the silicone as per the manufacturer's instructions, and before you actually pour the silicone into the mould, take a release agent. So I've just used GT85, any kind of oil will do. This is just cheap from Aldi's at £1.99, and just spray. Make sure you get all around the edge and obviously over the brick pieces as well. Not too much, don't go mad, just give it a nice light spray over the top, and then when you pour your silicone in and it cures, it'll be a lot easier to actually demold. So after you've poured your silicone in and you've left it to cure, probably overnight, so about 24 hours to cure, to make sure it's fully cured, you'll be faced with something like this. So the way to actually demold is to take the screws out from underneath that you've placed in, and then you'll find it quite easy to just manipulate these pieces of wood and they will actually come off. And then once they're off, it's just a case of just very gently easing back and just peeling this silicone mould off. Once you've got the silicone mould out, and obviously you've taken the bricks pieces out, you can then push it back in again, and that's it. You're ready to go. You can start to actually cast your brick tiles. So the equipment we're going to need to make these brick tiles, we're obviously going to need a mould. So this mould, the making of this mould is covered in the 4th video in this series, so have a look at that. We're also going to need a small bucket and also something to mix the colour cement in. So this is an old pointing trowel, bricklayer's pointing trowel. You're going to need something to actually measure out the sand and cement. So this is a pot of ice cream. I think there's these little pots of ice cream you can get in Lidl or Aldi's, but a small plastic yogurt pot will do exactly the same thing and give you the right quantity so there's no waste. We're also going to need some standard red building sand, some standard Portland cement as well. As far as the dye goes for actually colouring the cement, so we've got red cement powder or colour, and then to add that black detail we've got black colouring powder for cement, and also just a cheap brush, paint brush, in order to apply it with. As a release agent, so we need a release agent as well, so the tiles, once they're cured, will demold easily. So I'm using GT85. Any sort of lubricant style spray is ideal. This is just cheap from Aldi's, about £1.99, so that's why I'm using that. So the first thing we need to do is to measure out the sand and cement, and the ratio is 5:2. So with your yogurt pot or a small pot, whatever you've got, 5 building sand, 2 cement, that will give you enough to cover your 9 compartment mould. I'm going to obviously use less in order to fill these 6 compartments, but it's the same ratio, 5:2. So the first thing we need to do is to mix our sand and cement thoroughly. We then take our red mortar colour. Now, it's not very scientific this, but the way I measure it is just on the end of the pointing trowel, just 2 of these, so 2 heaped portions on the end of the trowel like that. That is the bare minimum that you'll need to actually colour this mortar. So what I normally do is, in one batch I'll do 2 red, and in another batch I'll do 3, and I'll just vary it as long as I don't go down below the 2 portions that you need for the red dye. If you go less than that, what happens is the brick tile will start to become grey and it doesn't look very realistic. So 2 is a minimum, then maybe another batch do 3, and just vary it so that you get a good variation around the actual pizza oven dome once these are obviously cured and you're putting them on, and that gives it a more realistic effect. So you just mix this red powder in as best you can. So the next thing to do now is to add the water, and it's difficult to actually tell you how much water to add because it depends how wet the sand is. There's a number of things that can affect it, but what I'll do is I'll mix the water and show you the type of consistency that you're looking for. Okay, so that's the water now added to the sand and cement. Unfortunately, this is like a 3 bears kind of situation. You don't want the mortar to be too wet. If it's too wet and we start to put the black powder detail in, what will happen is that black powder will just merge with all of the red in the dye, and it just won't look very realistic at all, because we obviously, if we're placing the black powder in a certain place, we want it to stay there. So don't have it too wet. If you have it too dry, it's not going to flow out and get into all these little spaces. So you basically want it so it's firm, it stays in shape on the trowel, but it's still quite soft. So almost, well, it'd be ideal if it was the same as a bricklayer would use, obviously, when they're bricklaying. So not too wet, not too dry. The next thing we want to do is we just want to put our release agent actually into the mould. So make sure you get it just on all the edges. Just a light spray, that's all. And then just in the centre. Now we've got that, we take our black powder and using just a standard paintbrush, just dip that in. So I'm just looking for, what I'm trying to do is replicate the on the actual stand with the flagstones on that the pizza oven's going to sit on top. I had a look at what old bricks I'd used there, what they look like, and I'm just trying to replicate that pattern. So just dab the black powder just quite randomly. And the next thing to do is just to fill each of these compartments. Once you've put roughly what you need in each compartment and just sort of pushed it out towards the edges, just give this a little shake, just keep turning it, just so that the coloured mortar can find its way into all these little spaces. So once you're happy that that's filled out all of the into all of the little nooks and crannies, you just want to skim any excess off the top. Okay, so this is now going to, well, for me personally, this is going to go into our greenhouse because it'll be a faster curing time. But depending on the weather, if the weather's cold, if you're doing this in winter, you need to cure these inside. You're looking at about 8 hours to cure properly, to demold. If it's a hot day, and it looks like it's going to be a hot day here today, and I'm placing these into the greenhouse, I might get away with a 4-hour demold, but you'll just have to assess that yourself. Obviously it has to be quite hard. You've got to be very careful when you're demolding, especially if there's still a little bit damp, but we'll get to that. Obviously once this is cured, I'll then show you how to demold these. Okay, so these brick tiles now have been curing for about 5 hours. It's a very warm day today. Well, it is for us in the north of the UK. So I'm going to risk demolding these after 5 hours. My recommendation to you is, start off with a minimum of 8 hours cure, and then you'll be able to obviously assess it from there. If you do break any, so if any crack in half when you're demolding them, save them, because you will need halves for the design once you start going around the pizza oven dome. So the best way I've found to actually demold these is take a nice fluffy cloth onto a piece of wood, place it over the top of the mould, and then just turn everything over, and then just very gently just start to lift the wooden form, and hopefully you'll start to hear, or you'll feel, the actual tiles coming out from underneath. Okay, so we haven't broke any. We've got little bits coming off at the side, but that's fine, it just adds more character to it. So that's what you're faced with now. These still need curing, obviously a lot more. Take about a couple of days to fully dry out. So I'm just going to leave these on the board for now, do another mix, and then fill these, fill this mould again, and you just start the process over and over again. What I've found though is, the best way I've found to do it is, I've done a mix in the morning, obviously filled up the mould, gone to work, come back, roughly 8 or 9 hours, demolded, do another one, let that cure overnight, and then just carry on that process. And if you do that, it'll take you, with a 9 compartment mould, it'll take you about 8 days, I think, to get the amount of tiles you're going to need to do the dome and the entrance to the pizza oven. But in that time, you also got to allow, obviously, for the vermiculite concrete on the dome and the base to cure. So once that's cured, you should have enough tiles then to actually complete the job, so there'll be no delays in you completing this project.